What happens when people stop connecting the dots? I asked that question yesterday. Today, I want to ask a harder question. Why do they stop? Now, that may sound like a strange question, but I want you to think about it. Because every day, I encounter people who appear perfectly normal. Perfectly. They drive cars, they hold jobs, they raise children, they pay taxes, they discuss baseball, they discuss the weather, they discuss their grandchildren. You can have perfectly fine and normal conversations with them. You won't suspect a thing. And then you touch one particular subject, one particular construct, one particular belief, and suddenly everything changes. And this is Politics by Jake. Welcome to the show. This is the weekend show, part 2, weekend, Sunday, May 31st, 2026. And I say to my viewers and my subscribers and followers, welcome to the show. Welcome to the fight, because we're in a fight, and it's existential. Thus having said, let's continue, shall we? I want to be careful here, because people hear the words like psychosis, and you've heard me talk about this many times. Not exactly as long as I've been on the air, but you've heard me talk about the Jungian thing. I refer to it as the Jungian thing. Carl Jung, Swiss psychiatrist, born 1875. And he talked about the idea of a strange kind of psychosis. He called it a collective psychosis, not merely embodied in one person, but in an entire group. It is collective. It is people possessed, if you will, if you want to use that language, in the very same way. And that's what's important, because people hear the words like psychosis and they immediately imagine a person screaming at invisible enemies, talking to voices that no one else can hear. I am reminded once again of Jethro Tull's Mad Men on the Water. And this is an old album, but if you look at the album, you see a depiction of a man suffering perhaps from neurosis, perhaps from psychosis, but it is a more frenzied look, you see. And that certainly exists. There are those people. But this is not what I'm talking about. And this is one of the great societal problems that we face. Because these people are walking among us and they appear perfectly normal. You could have a fine conversation daily with any of them about this topic or that topic, and you would never suspect a thing. It's this kind of person that I'm talking about. Something much more subtle, something about which nevertheless you need to be aware because it fits the description. I'm talking about a person who appears entirely normal, entirely, until you touch the one idea around which their world has organized itself. And then you discover quite rapidly ordinary reasoning begins to fail. Let me tell you, let me share an experience with you. I have a minor in psychology in my undergraduate degree. This, as I have said before, is just enough to get me into trouble when I am about and out in polite society. I used to say it's enough to get me into trouble when I go into French restaurants, but it's more generally speaking, polite society. And part of our training was that we had to go to these mental facilities and we had to view the people who had been committed. And they were, and I don't want to say they were in cells. I don't want to say they were in padded rooms, but yeah, they were in rooms. And you could talk to some of these people and they were entirely normal and they were genial and they were affable and they were gregarious, but not in a manic way. There was this one guy, and I'll give you an example because he stands out in my mind. I can see him in my mind's eye, even as I am speaking to you, my subscribers and followers and listeners and viewers now. And he engaged me one day, and I knew him. I saw him all the time because I worked at one of these facilities. And I engaged with the inmates or the clients or the patients or whatever you want to call them all the time. And he talked to them and he talked to me and he said, did you know that among all the species that have been created, that the housefly is the most compassionate of them? And you must understand, I must convey to you, it is so important for me to convey to you, as crazy as this sounds, because it is absolutely directive of the point I am trying to make. Absolutely directive. Please, please, please listen to what I am saying and take my words and understand them. And he said it's the common housefly. He says they're a very advanced species. And of course, at this point, I knew something was off because I had studied physiology and comparative anatomy. And I understood that, insects operate on neurochemical things that appear to be intelligent, but they're not. But okay, so all right. And he said, yes. And he said it with a complete straight face, and with such a straight face that if you were not educated or apprised enough, or if you were so taken by them, and this is an important part of the MAGA psychology and phenomenon also, and the collective psychology and phenomenon also. And we will go through that today, which is why I tell you now, because I am telling you a patently absurd thing uttered by a person who appears completely rational, but it's utterly absurd. And we will have examples of this later in the show for exhibits. But he said, yes, the housefly is the most compassionate creature. They are the most intelligent creatures on the face of the earth. And they're compassionate. And he said, do you know why? And I said, no, tell me. He said, well, the housefly is alien to this earth. The housefly comes from another planet. It is the Housefly Planet. And one day, one of them flew off the planet and got lost. And he said, now they are all here looking for him. And I smile as I recall this because, of course, this is absurd. Of course, you can understand that this is a person who, if they actually believe this, is possessed of a serious mental aberration and deserves to be committed to the institution in which you find such a person. But other than that, I assure you, he's completely normal. He appeared completely normal. And this is what I'm talking about. A person who appears completely normal until you touch, or if they offer, the one idea around which their world has organized itself. Because remember, what is the primary symptom? The initial symptom, the absolute sine qua non, which means without which not. Schoolboy Latin, you'll have to pardon me. What is the primary symptom of a psychosis? It is a departure from reality. It is a creation of an alternative construct. Why? Because reality has become too painful, too traumatic, and the mind breaks. And that's psychosis. And you see, as we all saw from my example of the housefly, ordinary reasoning begins to fail. Not necessarily intelligence. This was an intelligent man. Not necessarily reasoning. It's reasoning. And there's a difference. And I think one of the reasons that people fail to understand this phenomenon is that nobody explains it to them. There's a characterization of people who are mentally ill, which is my Madman on the Water's characterization. And people accept that because they can understand that, but they don't understand the housefly, and they don't understand what I told you about the person who related the story to me. People say somebody is crazy. Fine. What does that mean? People say somebody is delusional. Fine. What does that mean? How does it actually work? Why does it matter? Because once you understand it, you begin to see it everywhere. You see it in politics. You see it in religion. You see it in cults. You see it in history. And this is the deceptive thing, because these people appear to you and come to you cloaked, as it were, in the guise, the acceptable guise of normality. Something you can understand. And increasingly, you see it in American public life. Let's look at an example, okay? I was going to take a break at this point, but let's get into this. I recently watched an interview with an older gentleman. He appears perfectly normal, articulate, pleasant, mild-mannered, thoughtful, not angry at all, not frothing, not irrational in any obvious sense. So I was going to paraphrase this, and I'll talk about it and add my comments, but I'm going to actually, it's important enough so that I read to you what the interviewer said and what the words and the transition was between the interviewer and the interviewee, who's this old man that I told you of. So, all right. So the interviewer asks this, and as you can see, I'm reading. Is Donald Trump? What is Donald Trump? I think he is the hand of God, literally, and we have been waiting for years for someone like him to come along. And the interviewer says, "What does that mean, literally?" And the interviewee, this old, mild-mannered man, intelligent, articulate. It means that he's the central figure for Christianity, the central figure for the future of humanity at this point. And the interviewer says, Donald Trump is? And the old man says, yes. Donald Trump, the interviewer asks, is the central figure for Christianity right now? And the old man says, absolutely. America basically represents the history of Christianity, the culmination. America represents the culmination of Christianity, and Trump is the central figure. Okay, that's the first I've heard of that, the interviewer says. What does that mean? He's the central figure. And the old man says, because it's his responsibility to guide the future of humanity and the future of America. It rests on his shoulders. And the interviewer says, do you believe Donald Trump was picked by God? And he says, well, and this is interesting. This is me talking, saying this is interesting. Well, he says, I believe that the Reverend Moon, no less. I believe that the Reverend Moon prayed for 10 years for someone like him to come along. So yeah, I think he is literally the hand of God. Now, I watched this clip. I saw this. I just read it to you because I thought it was very important. And I think I have some other clips that I'm going to read to you too. Thoughtful. Obviously thought about this. Not angry, not frothing, not irrational in any way that you could ever see by looking at him, by listening to him, or by interacting with him. And when he was asked about Donald Trump, he said Donald Trump is the central figure of Christianity. Not one figure amongst many, mind you, the central figure of Christianity. He said that Donald Trump is the future of humanity. He said that Donald Trump is literally the hand of God. Now, stop right there, okay? I don't want you to react politically. I want you to observe, because that's the important thing, okay? Observe. Notice, and you'll have to take it from me because I'm relating it to you third hand, but trust my observations. And go look at it on the internet if you wish. Notice this man does not, and if you do, you will see, this man does not appear insane. He appears normal. He appears genial. He's elderly. He appears entirely ordinary, and yet he has reached a conclusion that most Christians throughout 2,000 years of Christian history would regard as extraordinary. How does that happen? That's the question we're talking about. Not whether he's right, not whether he's wrong. How did he get there in his mind? What process led him to draw such a startling and extraordinary conclusion? What chain of reasoning produced that conclusion? Or did reasoning have anything to do with it at all? Because once identity takes over, once belonging takes over, once emotional investment takes over, something else begins to happen. The conclusion no longer follows from the present. The conclusion, no, I'll repeat that. It's a scholarly, lawyerly phrase. The conclusion no longer follows from the premises. And that's where things become dangerous. And at this point, I think we've gone on long enough without a break. Let's take a break. Let's break the station, give you a commercial or two, and then we'll be back. And this is Politics by Jake. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. All right, and we're back, and this is Politics by Jake. I break down political and economic. This is what I do on the show. I break down political and economic realities so that you can see what's really happening, and accordingly and concomitantly, how to position yourself and to protect your family, protect your business, so on and so forth. If you want that kind of analysis that I'm doing here, applied directly to your situation, I do offer one-on-one private strategy sessions. The link's in the description. And with that, let's continue. So, all right, we've talked about the old man, haven't we? And that he engaged in something where you would have to assume that because identity, something took over. Something made it so that the conclusion that he drew no longer follows from the premises. And this is the basis of a psychotic break, which is what I'm trying to tell you. I used the example of the patient that I encountered and the housefly scenario because that is rather more obvious. But there are other things out there that are just as obvious. And I want to go and I want to show you a couple of here. Let me give you another example of this. This one is even more disturbing because it involves a lawyer, and it's personally disturbing for me after 30 years in the legal profession as well. A witness is asked about the 22nd Amendment. Now, every lawyer knows what it says. I'm going to just read it to you like I did the other one. So this is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and he's talking to, or it's not Sheldon Whitehouse, I take it back. I don't know who the senator is, but he's talking to a Trump attorney, and he says, do you know what does the 22nd Amendment say? And the attorney responds, Senator, my career has been mostly in criminal prosecution. And initially he tries to avoid it, you see. He tries to shift and dodge and two-step and shuck and jive. But eventually the questioner pins him down. And this is what he says. He says, my career has mostly been in criminal prosecution. I haven't had an opportunity to use that one, to use the 22nd Amendment, see, specifically. And there are other people sitting there who are also subjects of the very same interview that lawyer is directing to that one, that senator is directing to that one attorney. And so he calls out, he says, is anyone able to help? And they're all lawyers. Is anyone able to help on the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution? And the lawyer says, Senator, I believe it is the amendment that deals with the two-term limitation on the service of the president. The senator says, that's correct. It states that no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. Mr. Mark, that's the name of the attorney he's talking to, is President Trump eligible to run again for president in 2028? And this is what Mark says. Senator, without considering all the facts and looking at everything, depending on what the situation is, this to me strikes as more of a hypothetical of something that could be. And he's interrupted. And the senator says, it's not a hypothetical, okay? And remember who he's talking to. He's talking to another lawyer, and he's a lawyer himself. We are skilled in logic and in reasoning. We are skilled in debate. Although you could argue, and this is an aside that I'm just giving to you, in law school, what you don't learn how to practice. This is what was actually told to me. You don't learn how to practice law in law school. What you learn is called black letter law. In other words, you learn what the law is. That's what you learn. So anyway, getting back to this. So he says to him, it's not a hypothetical, okay? And he asks him again, has President Trump been elected president twice? And listen to what Mark says. He says, President Trump has been certified the president of the United States 2 times. Senator says, is he eligible to run for a 3rd term under our Constitution? And Mark says, I would have to review the... And then the senator interrupts and says, look, all I need to tell you is the language of the constitutional amendment that makes it clear that no, he is not eligible to run for a third term. Okay? See, the language of the amendment is plain. There's no disputing this. And then the senator calls out and he says, and I'm snickering as I'm speaking to you, because as you can understand, this discussion and exchange has become absurd. It has become ludicrous. It has become something which your 12th grade English teacher would call Kafkaesque. Franz Kafka was a writer who talked about absurd situations, talked about the absurd nature of reality, and he wrote something called The Trial. It's excellent. You should read it. But that's what it is, absurdity. It has become absurd. Because what the lawyer is doing is trying to argue that a conclusion that should follow naturally from the premise does not in fact follow, and he's trying to avoid it. So the senator asks, he says, anyone else brave enough to say that the Constitution of the United States prevents President Trump from seeking a third term? Anybody? Is there anybody willing to apply the Constitution in its plain language? Plain language, that's a term of art amongst lawyers in the craft. Anybody willing to apply the Constitution by its plain language in the 22nd Amendment? And there's like dead silence. It's crickets. And then he says, okay, nobody. All right. And then he says, let's move on. And that's the end of the clip. Now, let me be clear about this, okay? Mark, who is the witness, he knows what the 22nd Amendment says. He's talking to another lawyer, and that lawyer knows he knows, and he knows he knows, and it's an absurdity. It is solemn mockery of the process of a hearing that's designed to adduce information. It's deceptive. And Mark, who is the witness, acknowledges that it limits, titularly, he talks about certified, acknowledges that it limits a president to 2 elected terms. The witness acknowledges that President Trump has been elected twice. He says certified, but, you know, that's an admission. What you've got right there, if you were a judge and you knew the law, you'd say, okay, that's an admission. The witness has acknowledged that Donald Trump has been elected twice. Then comes the question, can he run again? And now, Mark can't answer. Now, lawyers have a phrase, and I just told it to you. The conclusion follows from the premises. Now, let's just explain that a little bit. In plain English, connect the dots. Okay? This is an easy syllogism. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. You see what I mean? The conclusion follows from the premises. Do you understand? You don't get to say, well, you know, yeah, I'd have to look into that. Let me get back to you. But that's precisely what happened in that exchange that I just described to you. Well, I'd have to look into that, but I can get back to you. The witness knew the amendment. That was mere sophistry, and an unartful sophistry, may I say. The witness knew that Trump had been elected twice. The witness possessed every fact necessary to answer that question, and yet the conclusion could not be spoken. Why? You see? That's the phenomenon that we're talking about. That's what we're examining here today. Not politics, not Trump, not the Democrats, although God knows I talk about all three of those a lot. Not Republicans. Why? This is it. Why do people stop following conclusions that follow directly from facts that they themselves acknowledge? And I mean, at this point, let's take another break before we go on. We've got more to talk about on the show. This is Politics by Jake, and we will be back. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. All right, and this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And as I state often on the show, what I do on the show is this. I break down political and economic realities so that you can understand what's what's happening. And what's very important to you personally is how to position yourself, what this all means to you. If you want this applied directly to your situation, I can do that for you. And I offer private one-on-one strategy sessions. And if you're interested in that, the link's in the description. Get a hold of me. So that's that. All right. Now back to what we were talking about. And we're going down the rabbit hole here, folks. You recall in Matrix how Morpheus said to Neo, I show you how far the rabbit hole goes. Well, we're going down the rabbit hole here. I just ended, before the commercial and break, with this premise. Why do people stop following conclusions that follow directly from facts they themselves acknowledge? In other words, man is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's what I mean. All right? Now, let me make the problem even worse, okay? Because up to this point, you could argue, you could say, oh, well, you're talking to an old man. You're talking about ordinary people. Maybe they're just misinformed. Maybe they don't understand the facts. Maybe they don't know what happens. Well, I showed you Mark, the lawyer, and I showed you where that goes. But let's assume all of that, okay? Because that guy's just a rank and file ordinary lawyer. Let's say that he's ordinary in that way. Let's say that he's, in his own way, he's like the old man, all right? What happens when the people involved know exactly what happened? So let's talk about a fellow named Brad Raffensperger. Here's a man who was directly involved. He wasn't reading newspaper accounts. He wasn't watching YouTube. He was there. He received the pressure. He knew what happened. He rejected the prepper. He publicly maintained that Trump had lost Georgia. So what happened was this. Raffensperger was contacted by the White House. Donald Trump came on the phone. And you may remember this. And Raffensperger, by the way, is the Secretary of State for the state of Georgia in 2020. That's what he was. And Donald Trump comes on the phone and says, you know, how you doing? I need 11,000, I think it was 11,280 votes, which is more than I have right now. And to make a long story short, I would like to portray the whole thing to you, and I apologize for not having it at hand here. But Raffensperger said, well, you know, I love you and I voted for you, but you lost Georgia. You didn't get it. There aren't 11,280 or 81 votes for you. There isn't one vote for you. And if they were here, I would give them to you. And let me state equivocally, I love you, I voted for you, and I will vote for you again. And we have to think that he did in 2024, don't we? But I'm sorry, I can't. I have to do my duty. You lost. Okay? That's the short version of it. I apologize I didn't prepare. I don't have the long version. But that's the short version of what happened. So here's the question, everybody. Why isn't Brad Raffensperger, why at that very moment was Brad Raffensperger Secretary of State for the state of Georgia not forever disabused of the notion that Donald Trump was legitimate, was nothing but a crass, white-collar, petty criminal who was trying to throw a federal election? What was that? And why isn't Brad Raffensperger a never-Trumper? Why didn't he become that at that very moment? Why isn't he leading anti-Trump rallies now? Why isn't he appearing on MSNBC every night? He actually did appear on MSNBC once or twice at the time. Why does he remain? Why did he say, I will vote for you again? See, the question isn't whether Brad Raffensperger is right. The question is, how does a human being confronted with the enormity of what he was being asked? He was being asked to become complicit in the crime of vote fraud. He was asked to be the focal point for the state of Georgia for the throwing of a federal election to Donald Trump, who asked him specifically for 11,280 votes. Not one, not two, not five, not 10, not 100. 11,000, upwards of 11,000, as I say. This is the question that you have to ask, okay? In such a circumstances as this, because remember, you said, I love you, I voted for you, I'll vote for you again. How does a human being hold both of those things in his mind simultaneously? Okay. Now let's leave Georgia, shall we? And let's move to Arizona. All right, let's go to Arizona. Same phenomenon, different state, different man, same puzzle. Once again, let me reiterate the questions just so we're clear. If Trump asked you to do something improper and you refused and you knew it was improper, why would you still support him? So, okay. So here we are. we've magically transported to Arizona. We're in Scottsdale or Phoenix or, wherever it is, Tucson. I'm not entirely sure I ever want to be in Tucson, Arizona. I've been there. I've got the T-shirt on that. But anyway, let's move there. We're somewhere in Arizona. Scottsdale is good. Let's go to Scottsdale. Doug Ducey, okay? 2021, not a local election worker, not a volunteer, not a clerk. Doug Ducey is the governor of the state of Arizona, the sovereign state of Arizona. Donald Trump loses Arizona. Trump calls Ducey, does the same thing that he did with Raffensperger. Pressures Ducey regarding the election results. Ducey refuses. Ducey certifies the election. Ducey publicly acknowledges the legitimacy of the outcome. Says the same thing. I love you. I voted for you. I'll vote for you again. But hey, you lost. Better luck next time, pal. When are you coming to Scottsdale? So now comes the question. Why isn't Doug Ducey an ever-Trumper? Why doesn't he emerge from that experience right then, right there, saying, I realize what happened here. This man attempted to pressure me. This man attempted to compromise me. This man attempted to get me to go back on my integrity as a public official. This man attempted to recruit me in a conspiracy to throw a federal election. In states control election, the governor of the state of Arizona is in control of the election. This man was wrong. This man wanted me to become a criminal with him. This man should never hold office again. Instead, years later, he remains broadly supportive and ultimately endorses Trump again. Now, understand here, okay? I am not asking whether Doug Ducey is right. I'm asking how the process works. How does a human being hold, and this is serious stuff we're talking about. This isn't just hold my coat while I go in and get a candy bar. It's like hold my coat while I go in and rob this store and kill everybody inside. This is kind of like how this is, as far as seriousness. This is serious. And he's asking him willy-nilly, on the spot, to compromise everything that he's built up in his professional career. Up to that point, in a moment. Imagine the arrogance of the man. And I'm talking about Donald Trump. So how does a human being hold both those realities in his mind? See, that's the question. I'm not asking whether it's right. I'm asking how the process works. That's what I'm asking. And at this point, let's take another break. And this is Politics by Jake, and we will most certainly be back. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. right. This is Politics by Jake, and I'm back. Now, on the show, I break down political and economic reality so that you can understand what's actually happening, how to position yourself, your family, yourself, your wealth, your business for its longevity and its survival and its thriving. If you want this kind of applied analysis done directly on your situation, I offer private one-on-one strategy session. Links in the description. So that said, let's continue. Now, I think that people organize themselves around lighthouses, fixed points, things they refuse to surrender, things around which all other facts must be arranged. And for some people, it's a religion. For some people, it's nationalism. For some people, it's ideology. For some people, it's class. For some people, it's race. And for some people, it's Donald Trump. So the question is this. What happens when the lighthouse becomes more important than reality? And I'm not describing it as psychosis. I'm not describing it as a break from reality, which it is. I'm being gentle for the more sensitive listeners and viewers in my audience who may think that the word psychosis is being too liberally or too blatantly applied. I'm talking about the lighthouse, okay? Okay. Let's move on to national security. Let's move to intelligence. Let's move to Tulsi Gabbard, who is like a Democrat. Because what happens next is this is fascinating. So you may not know her. Who is Tulsi Gabbard? Tulsi is a former Democratic member of the United States House of Representatives from Hawaii, from the state of Hawaii, 2013 to 2021. So she was there for a while. She served in the Hawaii National Guard and deployed to Iraq. She ran for president in 2020 as a Democrat. Wow, maybe she's got it in for Joe Biden too. She became increasingly critical of Democratic Party leadership and foreign policy, left the Democratic Party in 2022, became aligned with Donald Trump and his movement, one of the most probably the most pro-Russia, pro-Putin members in Congress when she was there. I mean, I don't have time to go into that. That's not what this segment is about, but she was. And she currently, although I think she's gone now, if not, she's going, currently serves as the notes that I have, Director of National Intelligence in the Trump administration. And for the purposes of the timeline that we're talking about, that's what she was, okay? So this is not a lightweight. This is not a random influencer. She's not a talk show host, okay? She's the Director of National Intelligence. She's sitting in front of Congress. I'm about to read you another transcript, discussing intelligence assessments. That gives weight to the exchange. Because this, and this is why this exchange this is why I'm bringing this to you. This is why this is so fascinating. Because once again, we have acknowledged facts. And, I called it psychosis, and then I said, for the more sensitive of our listeners, we're going to call it the lighthouse and the viewers. And once again, we encounter an apparent inability to state the conclusion that follows of necessity. Like, that is, man is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Of necessity, that's true. And this is another example of an apparent inability to state the conclusion, and I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but an apparent inability to state the conclusion that follows from pretty much self-evident facts. Okay, here's the transcript. The questioner asks, and this is a congressional hearing, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated, right? And she says, that's right. And the questioner says, and is that, in fact, the assessment of the intelligence community? Yes. She says yes. So the assessment of the intelligence community is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated by last summer's airstrikes. And she says yes. And the questioner says, in the opening statement you submitted to the committee last night, you also stated, quote, there has been no effort since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability, end quote, correct? And she says, that's right. And he says, and that's the assessment of the intelligence community. She says, yes. And then he says, the White House, the questioner, I apologize, I don't have this by the time we're going to recording on this, I don't have this, but the questioner says the White House stated on March 1st of this year that this war was launched and was, quote, a military campaign to eliminate the imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, end quote. That's a statement from the White House. Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was an imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime? Yes or no? And Tulsi Gabbard says, Senator, the only person who can determine what is and what is not an imminent threat is the president. And the questioner immediately says, false. And he says, this is a worldwide threat hearing where you present to Congress national intelligence, timely, objective, and independent of political considerations. You stated today, he says, that the intelligence community's assessment is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated, and the threat, therefore, posed by the Iranian regime. Yes or no? And Gabbard says, Senator, notice she's repeating herself, okay? Senator, the only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president. And the questioner immediately says, false. This is a worldwide, and notice he repeats himself too. He says this up to a certain point. He says, this is the worldwide threats hearing where you present to Congress national intelligence, timely, objective, remember, timely, objective, independent of political considerations. You stated today that the intelligence community's assessment is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated and that, quote, there had been no efforts since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. He's moving on at this point. He's not repeating himself anymore. He says, was it the intelligence community's assessment that nevertheless, despite this obliteration, there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, yes or no? And Gabbard responds and says, it is not the intelligence community responsibility to determine what is and what is not an imminent threat. That is up to the president based on a volume of information that he receives. And he says, false. It is precisely your responsibility. You're here to be timely. You're here to be objective. And you're here to be independent of political considerations. And she says, that's exactly what I'm doing. And he says, no. What you're doing is you're evading the question. Because to provide a candid response to the committee would contradict a statement from the White House. No. You're evading a question. Because to provide a candid response to the committee would contradict a statement from the White House. And that's it. That's the end of the transcript. So here's the forensic analysis. I haven't read that. The senator asks a series of straightforward questions, okay? The intelligent community's assessment is X, correct, correct. The intelligent community's assessment is Y, correct, correct. The intelligence community's assessment is Z, correct, correct. And then comes the conclusion, the denouement. Suddenly we have a problem. Suddenly we have an evasion. Suddenly we have repeated deflection. Suddenly we have an inability to state what appears to be the obvious implication of facts that have already been acknowledged. Now, understand, I'm not talking about Iran. I'm using it as an example. I'm not talking about Tulsi Gabbard. I'm using her as an example, sure. I'm talking about a phenomenon, and I want to be understood when I say that. Again, the rule is this, and I think it's a good rule, and I think it's highly reasonable. The conclusion follows from the premises. The facts have already been acknowledged. The evidence has already been acknowledged. The question has already been answered. And yet, somehow, the final step cannot be taken. That's the question. All right, we're at the end of our time. We may have to do a part 3 on this. And this is Politics by Jake. This has been the weekend show. And we hope you will have a good week. And we will, God willing, we will be back next weekend with more on this. Bye-bye now.